If you work in a big company, you probably use at least one software that you absolutely hate. It's annoyingly slow, terribly clanky, and just feels off. In fact, using it feels so bad that you can't help but think that the people who made it hates you personally. In this video, I'll try to explain why enterprise products sucked in the past, how a group of revolutionaries tried to change that, and how it now sucks in a new and a refreshing way. Part 1. The roots of sucky software. Enterprise software, which is software that is being used by big organizations, is as old as software itself. In fact, big organizations have adopted computers much earlier than regular folks. But things really took off only in the 80s with the adoption of personal computers with graphical interfaces. We're going to take a look at some of these products in just a second, but I have to warn you first, it's not going to be pretty. Pretty horrifying. These products were terrible for a simple reason. We simply didn't know any better. Basic UX concepts just weren't invented yet. It took us some time to figure them out. So historically, enterprise software was bad, but then again, all software was bad. But a lot have changed since then. Computers started playing a bigger role in our lives, which meant there was more demand for software. Then something interesting happened. The user experience of consumer products got better and better each year. But enterprise product did not. In the early 2000s, many people were using apps like Facebook or YouTube that felt absolutely magical, but in their work lives, these same people used software that was clanky, old, and just felt like the 80s. Part 2. The revolution. So this wasn't going to stand. People started to realize that the same concepts that make consumer software good can be applied to enterprise software as well. So people started creating startups with the mission of making enterprise products great. These revolutionaries promised to rid the world of clanky user interfaces and bring in a new era of slick, modern UX. But the critical insight of revolutionary startups like Slack wasn't actually about how products should be designed, but rather, how should it be sold? Let me explain. You see, consumer products got better and better over time because companies were incentivized to offer the best UX possible. Users abandoned MySpace and migrated to Facebook just because they liked using Facebook better. That's simple enough to understand, but you would imagine that this logic applies to enterprise software as well. But that's not actually the case. According to the revolutionaries, the original sin of enterprise software is the separation between the user who uses the product and the buyer who can actually buy the product. You see, in big companies, users can't just decide to buy whichever software that they prefer the most. There's a process in place for that and a person that is in charge of that process. The title of that person can be head of IT or procurement manager or any other variation. But for our purposes, he's simply the buyer. And when buyers need to decide which software to choose, they usually don't give much weight to the user experience. This happens for two reasons. First, buyers aren't actually the ones who will be using the product, so sometimes they fail to appreciate just how bad a bad experience can be. Second, user experience can be kind of hard to evaluate. Professional buyers would compare the prices between different software and they would check for objective features like, can it export to Excel or does it integrate with our CRM? User experience tends to be more subjective and harder to compare, especially if you're not the end user yourself. Now, because professional buyers don't give much weight to the UX, big companies like Oracle or SAP can make tons of money selling software with UX that is terrible. For these products, the only thing that matters is having experienced salespeople selling the product. These salespeople know the professional buyer and they know how to get them to yes. And that's why the revolutionaries realized that to make great enterprise products, they need to revolutionize the sales process. Part 3. Product-led growth. There was no name for it initially, but over time, the process invented by the revolutionaries came to be called product-led growth, or PLG for short. In the PLG model, users can start using the product either for free or for a very low price that doesn't really require the professional buyer involvement. Notice that PLG companies usually don't make their money in the initial adoption phase. The first couple of users are just the way in. The real money comes when more teams start to use the product. At that stage, PLG companies will have to go through a professional buyer, but the dynamic is completely different since the usage of the product is already an established fact. This go-to-market approach incentivizes PLG companies to make great products that users actively choose to use. It's common for PLG companies to invest heavily in the initial user experience. Making the product feel absolutely amazing in the first week is critical for the success of the company. When people first started to use products like Slack, Box, or Figma, it blew their minds away. All of these products were on the cutting edge of sleek and user-friendly design. This all sounds like the happy ending of a fairy tale, where the hero PLG was able to beat the professional buyer villain, and all the citizens of the enterprise village lived happily ever after. And yet, we still find ourselves frustrated by the software that we use at work every day. Why is that? Part 4. The dark side of PLG. I'm going to describe some stuff I see in PLG companies all the time. Let me know if this sounds familiar. You're in a meeting and you open Asana because you want to get information on a specific task, but it takes forever to load, so in the meantime you have to engage in the worst torture of all, small talk. After the meeting, you open up Slack because you remember someone wanted something from you earlier in the day. But after visiting 50 different Slack channels, you remember it was actually an email. When you find the email, you see it's from a colleague who asks you to send some data. So you go to Mixpanel that asks you to log in with an SSO that requires 5 different authorization layers. When you're finally able to log into Mixpanel, you forgot why you came there in the first place, and you go back to Slack to figure it out. Slow performance, excessive clutter, overburdening permissions, what do all of these have in common? They all come with scale. When you first met Asana, it loaded instantly. There was no clutter in Slack when it was just you and your team using it. And no PLG product will make you jump through SSO hoops when you first log in. All of these come later. Remember that PLG companies obsess over creating the perfect experience for the first couple of users who start using the product. That means all the problems I've just mentioned don't get as much attention from PLG companies. Now, even if PLG companies wanted to focus on these problems, and usually there are some teams that are assigned for that, it would be very hard for them to do. PLG products are designed from day one for small teams. The tech stack, the data model, the general concept of the product, all of these usually aren't built for scale, and they're very hard to change. In fact, when you compare a shiny PLG product like Asana to an old dinosaur like SAP, you'll often find that it is the dinosaur that gives you the better user experience when it comes to scale. PLG has enabled us to dodge the professional buyer and create the perfect experience for small teams. But it turns out the professional buyer is actually pretty instrumental in evaluating objective things that matter at scale. Things like loading speed or permission features. There is a saying that drinking alcohol is like borrowing happiness from tomorrow. In a sense, using PLG products is like borrowing good user experience from the next couple of years. Part 5. Where do we go from here? The short answer is, I don't know. When you're building a software product, you always try to imagine the real-life situation in which the product will be used, and that imagination impacts the design decisions that are being made. The reality of a small team is so different from the reality of scale that it seems to me practically impossible to excel at both. One approach offered by the low-code, no-code movement is to let each team build their own highly customized, perfect solution for them. The downside of this approach is that with high flexibility comes high complexity, which makes it hard to build great products and even harder to maintain. If you think you know where this is going, please let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching the video all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.